We're at the penultimate lecture, so one more to go after this. And so today we're going to look at a couple different topics that I sort of fused together as dinosaurs in the Cenozoic. So it's going to be the KPG aftermath, and then looking at contemporary, a little bit about what happens in the Cenozoic, but then what's going on in contemporary time with the fossil trade and paleoethics. And then the final lecture will be about the legacy of the dinosaurs, mostly dinosaurs in popular culture and what the information about them means for us. But first, this just in future incarnations of the class, this will actually be in the previous lecture, or 2 lectures earlier. Literally, I got back to the office after teaching this lecture on Wednesday, and this information comes in, brand new information about the Chicxulub impact from that site Tanis that I talked about, that really cool site where, among other things, got the fish that were catching the droplets coming down from the Chicxulub impactor. Well, that team had another paper that just came out on Wednesday, and this one looked at data that tells us when in the year the impact seemed to have occurred. So they looked at a number of lines of evidence. In this particular one, this is looking at the spines of some of the fish that were there. And some of these fish are ones that migrate between saltwater during part of the year and freshwater during other parts of the year. And there's a record of that with regard to the isotopes in their bones. And so they sampled a number of them and found that these specimens were all consistent with the time of death, the season of death, put it that way, being in spring or summer in terms of these annual migrations. So this is a sturgeon spine. Also, they looked at the young fish, so not the fully grown fish, but the young fish, and looked at sort of the average size of those individuals. So we have here paddlefish, from the top of paddlefish, sturgeons, and bowfin fish. And the sizes that they saw looked like cohorts in the spring or summer. Additionally, they looked at some of the larvae of insects that are preserved in those the freshwater deposits that were incorporated in this. And they tended to show the suites of larvae that in the modern world one would expect in the spring or summer, not what you'd expect later in the summer or in the winter or autumn or things like that. So it all seems pretty consistent. This actually doesn't mean it wasn't Christmas. After all, this is telling us the season it occurred in. But it turns out if you were to take the calendar, the seasons actually rotate through on a scale of 100,000 years throughout time. So, currently, what the December is in the northern hemisphere is in the early winter. You go back 25,000 years, and it's in a different season. 50,000, 75,000, we go back 100,000, it's back in the winter again. So imagine that small scale of 100,000 year cyclicity extending back 66 million years. So we don't know what date it was or even what months it was, but we can tell what season it was, at least based on this data. So this would be boreal, that is northern hemisphere, spring and summer. Okay, so I mentioned a little bit before about some of the aftermath of the impact. For instance, the existence of this fungus spike in the layers immediately above the impact layer, so showing the decay of the remains of the Maastrichtian, and then the fern spike after light has come back, so the impact winter is over. The trees have been cleared out or devastated, at least by the global forest collapse. And ferns, which do well as disaster taxa today, recover pretty early on. And then it takes some time for the trees to come back in a larger scale. Of course, that makes sense. Trees take a long time to grow to full size. Ferns, not so much. And so here we see This is in the late Maastrichtian, and you can tell it because we've got a Tyrannosaurus foot right there, and some Triceratops back in the background. And then this would be, within a few thousands of years or so after the impact. The forests are gone. Freshwater turtles doing fine. So, one of the bigger animals in the environment at the time would be a soft-shell turtle. Mammals have come back out. So this is still really a disaster fauna. But over the course of time, the plants recover and the animals recover in their own way. And in fact, through a set of other discoveries in the American West, in this case in Colorado, not far from Boulder, a place called Coral Bluffs, or Corral Bluffs, sorry. We actually have a really good record of the changes of the flora and of the fauna, including the mammals. And in fact, these are based off of that. In fact, you can trace the size, so the maximum size of mammals from immediately before the impact. Largest mammals locally is a creature about the size of an otter or badger. Then at the disaster, there are only tiny mammals left. But over the course of time, and notice not terribly much time between here and here, that's just 1 million years, we see the stepwise increase of body size of mammals. Similarly, we see here first the fern spike on the scale of a few thousand years, then palm trees becoming more abundant, big trees of other sorts becoming abundant. We see the legumes coming in, beans of various sorts. So a recovery in terms of animals and of plants. And so these are actually illustrations representing some of these animals, some of these mammals here, and in fact they're eating some of these little beans and so forth. So creatures who had, of course, ancestors at the boundary, but evolved in these new conditions, and mammal size goes up. So here's from last 2 years ago. I like this quote. The end of the world already happened with the dinosaurs. We are the post-apocalyptic monsters. So yeah, when we look at this recovery, low diversity on land and sea at the beginning, but it's nowhere near as devastating as what happened at the Permo-Triassic extinction. That still remains unparalleled in scale in the history of life. So things were knocked back, and for a course on dinosaurs, the important stuff was knocked back. But overall, the world wasn't as devastated as it had been at the Permo-Triassic extinction. And in particular, for terrestrial organisms, the major large animals, i.e. dinosaurs, and to a lesser degree pterosaurs, large turtles, large terrestrial crocodilians, etc., are gone, but they're replaced by smaller groups of animals. And it takes some time for these smaller groups to achieve anything like giant size, but they do begin, as I showed, to get larger and larger, even on the scale of the first million years. We look at the ecosystems of the terrestrial realm in terms of the plants. Flowering plants, which had been present before and had been diversifying before, they actually recover better in some ways in the Paleocene. So they're doing better in the earliest Paleogene. The Paleocene is the first 10 million years of the Paleocene, of the Paleogene. And they overthrow, in their own way, the gymnosperms, the conifers and their relatives. So we have lots of broadleaf rainforests in many parts of the world. So in the early part of the Cenozoic, it was pretty similar climate-wise to the late part of the Mesozoic. Hotter than the modern world, wetter than the modern world, lots of rainforests around. But now it's rainforests that would look more like a modern rainforest to us in terms of the plants. And in this environment, the mammals undergo a major radiation. But it's not like everything else was held back. For instance, when we look in the Paleocene, so the early Paleogene, the sauropsids, the reptiles, are doing okay for the most part, the ones that made it through. Now, they're the descendants of these smaller groups that existed at the KPG, but or in the Cretaceous, but they're doing fine. So Champsosaurs doing fine, crocodilians, the semi-aquatic ones, are doing fine. Turtles, the aquatic ones, the freshwater ones, are doing fine. So there's actually, that's a snapping turtle skeleton from the early part of the Cenozoic, which would be very difficult for us to distinguish from a modern snapping turtle if you don't know turtles in detail. And in some places, like the tropics, I mentioned down here, but I'll show. In the tropics, in Amazonia, or what's now Amazonia, we have a huge radiation of large-bodied, cold-blooded reptiles. So this is distinct from what we saw in the Triassic. Well, there was a fair number of cold-blooded reptiles that were radiating in the Triassic. We saw many of those were sort of moderately warm-blooded, the Cenozoicians, or during the Jurassic and the Cretaceous, when, of course, dinosaurs are undergoing their big radiation, but as we saw, they're not cold-blooded. In the Paleocene, it's cold-blooded reptiles that are doing well. And in fact, for this epoch, this is the one time that we know of where snakes, or indeed any kind of lepidosaur, so that's the group that includes snakes and lizards and tuataras, are the largest animals on the planet. This is the time of Titanoboa, a giant anaconda relative. So as it says here, estimated about 43 feet long or so from the specimens. No, we don't have anything like a complete skeleton. And no, when you see the complete skeleton that's shared online as it goes through every so often in social, that is not, in fact, a Titanoboa skeleton. It is a skeleton from an art project. It is someone took a rattlesnake and showed it at gigantic size. This is an anaconda, or an anaconda relative. But it's still damn impressive. And it's not alone in its community. So it's the apex predator of its community. But there were large crocodilians, both semi-aquatic ones and fully aquatic ones. There were giant turtles. Some of the largest turtles of Earth history are from this time period, and so forth. And so maybe, if you were a time traveler or an alien, you were visiting the Earth, you said, maybe it's time for the cold-blooded reptiles to finally get their due. But it wasn't. Because this lasted for 10 million years or so, but the real radiations of the Cenozoic were in mammals, and especially in placental mammals. Indeed, the term adaptive radiation was coined for this event. When Osborn and others first came up with that term, they were referring to the diversification of placental mammals in the wake of the loss of the big dinosaurs. And in fact, we could see that reflected here from a relatively recent study where on the way this chart works, so we're going from geologic time from older to younger, so today is here. The gray dots are any fossil site, and it's the number of terrestrial species known from that fossil site. And then what you see in color are the sub-amount of the number of fossils from that site representing each of these groups. So here we see, these are for non-flying tetrapods, so they're excluding bats or excluding flying birds. Here we see non-avian dinosaurs throughout the Mesozoic. We get to the KPG boundary, I did it, and yeah, we lose them. Of course, that's a paraphyletic group. Birds are still part of Dinosauria, but for this purpose, it's useful because we can compare it to the history of the squamates. These are lizards and snakes, and the non-flying mammals. And we see the loss of the dinosaurs, the non-avian dinosaurs, doesn't really dramatically affect the diversification of the squamates. They're growing in diversity, but sort of at no higher rate after the boundary than they were before. But in the case of mammals, boom. The loss of dinosaurs seems to have uncorked their potential, our potential, mammalian potential. And there's a huge diversification. Now, there was a recent paper that talked about, yes, it's also probably the loss of some of the Mesozoic mammal groups that disappeared that may have been helping keep placentals down. But still, those other Mesozoic mammals were still all occupying small-bodied forms. Whereas now, mammals can do things that they couldn't before. So throughout the Cenozoic, we see things like the rise of large-bodied herbivorous mammals, something that had never existed before, because those niches were occupied. In order for mammals to have become large-bodied herbivores, they would have had to have outcompeted things like ceratopsids and hadrosaurids and titanosaurs and so on, and they just didn't have it in them. Or rather, they might have potentially, if you were to drop a modern, a Pleistocene or Holocene mammal back in the Mesozoic, it might have done pretty well. But you have to get there. You can't be fully developed as a highly sophisticated taxon. You have to start from an ancestral state and make it there. And that ancestral state would have to have outcompeted the animals that were already occupying those niches. Once those creatures were gone, though, they could start to occupy those niches. So we get all sorts of things. Eventually, we get some animals that get as big as non-sauropod dinosaurs ever got. But as I talked about before, they were never as diverse as large-bodied dinosaurs, or especially sauropods, through various limitations, like their mode of reproduction and their joints. But nevertheless, huge diversification of mammals throughout the Cenozoic on all the continents. So this is South America, about 3 million years ago or so. And, on up into the ice ages and up to today. And we can see, after the KPG boundary, so 7066 is about here. That mammalian size begins to increase. Notice the log scale over here. And as before with the dinosaurs, you typically get a separation on the scale of about an order of magnitude or so between the largest herbivores and the largest carnivores at any given time throughout the Cenozoic, but in this case of mammals. Just to point out, though, the top level of this is about 10 tons. So if we were talking about dinosaurs, we would need to go another level to get up to, the big titanosaurs at 50, 60, 70 or more tons. And so nevertheless, mammals did produce some large-bodied forms. But it is still true that that the dinosaurs fought on. There were various types of birds that have, throughout the Cenozoic, produced large-bodied forms, particularly large-bodied flightless forms, for obvious reasons. A flying bird can only get a certain size and still be effective. And in various spots of the world. For instance, here, this is in North America and Europe in the Paleocene and Eocene. We had these large flightless birds, initially thought to have been primarily carnivorous, but new interpretations of them suggest maybe these guys were actually herbivores. Here's a similar looking form, but distantly related, from much more recently in Australia. You can see how big it is compared to this work table here. And this form, which made it into modern times. It was around in the time of, 1,000, 2,000 years ago in Madagascar, but has since died out. The elephant birds, the largest land bird. Well, between these forms or these forms, one of the two of these groups would be the largest land birds of all time. In fact, in South America, the apex predators throughout most of the Cenozoic were either, depending upon the particular environment you were in, a group of near marsupials, called the sparacidonts, or these guys, the terror birds, the forest rakids, which were flightless carnivorous birds. These guys unquestionably carnivorous in terms of the shape of their claws and their beaks. So if you were to be transported back to South America before 3 million, basically between, say, 50 million and 3 million years ago, you are just as likely to be torn apart by a giant flightless bird, or as you might be by some sort of weird pseudo-marsupial. And here's some more of those. Actually, same guys I showed before. Elephant bird, Dromornis, diatrima. And one of those giant terror birds actually made it into North America, southern North America, when the Isthmus of Panama finally connected back up. So there were some giant predatory dinosaurs in North America for a bit. But while they were in North America, they were competing with a bunch of sophisticated predatory mammals, like basically dogs, cats, bears, and their cousins. And in fact, there was an island, a couple islands, called New Zealand, that up until about 1,000 years ago was a world of dinosaurs. Mammals did not, either were wiped out for the most part in New Zealand, or never really did well there. And so for most of the Cenozoic, the large-bodied animals were birds. The dominant group of herbivores were called moa, and they were called that because human beings arrived, and they called them this word, moa, the human beings in this case being the ancestors of the Maori and the Maori themselves. And there are some moa that were quite small, some were among the tallest birds of all time. One curious thing about them is that the moa, which are sort of distant cousins of the kiwis and ostriches and emus and so forth, they actually completed the reduction of the forelimb we saw in theropods. So, we had neotheropods lost digit 5, avitheropods lost digit 4, we saw tyrannosaurs that lost digit 3, alvarezsaurs, some of them lost everything but digit 1 and really small arms. Kiwis have really tiny little spike-like wings even today, so it has more things. These guys don't even have shoulder blades. They lost the scapula, the coracoid, the humerus, all the whole thing. They had no forelimb. Weird. But the top predators of the island, at least 4 of the islands of New Zealand, at least towards the very end of the Cenozoic, were giant eagles, among the largest eagles of all time. It is quite likely, when the humans arrived, that these eagles, who were used to attacking bipedal creatures, probably would go after humans, at least kids, if nothing else. Would have been a serious threat. But within 1,000 years or so of the human colonization of New Zealand, less than 1,000 years actually, the moa, the giant eagles, and so forth were wiped out. So, yeah. Dinosaurs might have been thinking about taking over in the Cenozoic, and in a few places it may have happened, but overall, no, it was the mammals who did the job. So, yet, we still have birds today, so dinosaurs are still around, and so the secret work of cats. We battled our ancient enemies for 150 million years, and their descendants still stalk the earth. So, the idea of the dinosaurian nature of birds is something that has actually finally permeated public consciousness. Here we go. Even more recently. Actually, a very small feathered dinosaur who evolved from you. Yes. But among the mammal radiations were arboreal mammals, that is the primates. We are the most sophisticated group, the most successful group of arboreal mammals. There have been other groups like squirrels and so forth among the rodents. We primates did really well up there. In fact, we did a lot of changes in our ancestry. We evolved back to having good color vision. And it isn't evolved back. Primates didn't retain color vision. Remember, color vision got really reduced in placental mammal history. And there's actually, you can see which genes, which color receptor was that got mutated to give us 3-color vision again. We have forward-pointing eyes. We have binocular vision, like Cenozoics, like derived Cenozoics. Why? Because we're up in the trees. When we were up in the trees, and having good depth perception, really important if you're jumping from tree to tree. And we have complex social structures, which resulted in really big brains. So wide radiation of primates throughout the Cenozoic in many parts of the world. This is about as Paris there. Among some of them are primates that primarily moved on top of the branches. Others that moved below. In fact, the ones that moved below, for the most part, we give the name apes, although that is a paraphyletic term with respect to humans. And indeed, we humans were part of the ape group that evolved into a new habitat, because starting around 7 to 5 million years ago, the world got a lot cooler and drier due to various tectonic changes, rearrangements of where the continents were, and so forth. And lots of animals adapted to this new environment. The grasslands expanded, the forest retracted, and our forest ancestors, well, some of them stayed back home. We call them apes. And one branch got out onto the plains and adapted to this new lifestyle. Starting in Africa, eventually spreading out to various other parts of the world. The features like big brains and so forth, and manipulative hands that are involved in the context of social creatures up in the trees, found new uses for this group until we started moving our way up the trophic level, from omnivores to predators of small animals, to predators of small animals and scavengers of big animals, to hunters of big animals, and eventually reaching the point where we had really quite large brains indeed and could take out pretty much any sort of creature that we would encounter. Spreading all over the planet, to eventually colonize every single continent. Although whether we say we colonize or simply inhabit Antarctica is a good question. And among other things we did is we started to notice that there were interesting things in the ground that were perhaps the skeletons of strange creatures that we had not seen with our own eyes before. And so that loops us back to the first couple lectures where I talked about the discovery of dinosaurs and so forth. So now we'll go forward and take a look at what it means as finding fossils and issues of paleoethics. Now, one thing I want to start off by saying is that fossil hunting is not paleontology. Paleontology is the scientific study of fossils. You can't do paleontology without finding fossils. That's absolutely true. But simply going out there and finding fossils doesn't make you a paleontologist, any more than finding a plant makes you a botanist. People who collect wildflowers are not necessarily doing botany, but some of them are. It depends upon what you do with the stuff you get. You might simply just, be pressing them and looking at them and appreciating them, in the case of flowers. So yeah, fossil hunting is a prerequisite part of this, but it's far from the whole science. And another way of thinking about it, first aid is not surgery, and not all people who give first aid are surgeons. However, often, if you don't give someone first aid, they're not going to be able to get the surgery. So yeah, I know people will indulge kids and say, "Oh, you found rocks, you found fossils, you're a real paleontologist," or something. No, really not. We actually have to do science, but that's okay. I understand why. Now, in the early days of paleontology, there were no professional paleontological researchers. We had people like Buckland, remember, who named Megalosaurus. He was professionally a theologian, so he was someone trying to understand the nature of God, and a geology professor. And so in that context, as a geologist, yes, the study of fossils came in part of that, but that wasn't, his primary goal wasn't actually to study fossils per se, although he did a lot of that. Or, Dr. Gideon Mantell, discoverer of Iguanodon and Hylaeosaurus, was a surgeon. So he healed people for a living, or healed as well as you can with surgery in the early 1800s. Marianne Mantell was a middle-class wife. It was Victorian times, folks. Women of that station didn't have professions or jobs, at least not typically. So yeah, they weren't. There were very few people who were doing professional paleontological research. That would come around later. But there were people who were professional fossil hunters. So Mary Anning, I mentioned her briefly when I talked about the discovery of fossils before, a working class woman in the early 1800s, worked down in the Lyme Regis region of southwestern England, found it was an extremely poor background, very working class background. Her family had been carpenters, and her dad actually had not only been a carpenter, but also would find fossils and sell them to richer people that were visiting. Lyme Regis was and remains actually a big tourist area in in the coast of England. And so people coming there might want to buy local curiosities and, hey, you can make some money off of it. Mary Anning and her brothers did this as well, but she's the one who was really, really good at it, finding fossils. Also with a background, a working background in carpentry and so forth, actually knew how to set up displays for them really well. And so found lots and lots and lots of fossils. So these are the rock units that she was working at. And this is an illustration of her. And in fact, many of her fossils were sold to professional researchers, including William Buckland, who I showed before, among others, and became the type specimens of lots of our various species of marine reptiles, of ichthyosaurs, of plesiosaurs, also pterosaurs, also lots and lots and lots of ammonoids in our record. And it is claimed by some that the seashells on the seashore tongue twister was named in her honor. That is really hard to totally ascertain. It's from the right time period, but other people sold seashells by the seashore. She did get a Google Doodle on the anniversary of her birth, so there it is. And just showing some of the things she found, some early specimens of ichthyosaurs, of plesiosaurs, and so forth. I mean, that was actually her illustration in a note about Plesiosaurus, the original specimen of Plesiosaurus. And at the end of her life, she actually got breast cancer, which, of course, is a serious disease even today. Back then, it was a death sentence. Also rather debilitating as it went through its the course of progression. And so her scientists who had benefited from her research before tried to help her out, tried to get her money, and in this case, one of her friends actually did this display, this print showing many of the fossils that she had discovered. And the proceeds of selling prints of this went to help fund her in her last few years. There's a movie that came out about her very recently. I actually have not seen it yet. Highly fictionalized, and there are stories in it for which there is no evidence. But hey, at least she's getting some representation. Hey, portrayed by Kate Winslet. That's pretty good. And so there has been this long tradition of people who have been professional collectors of fossils, so commercial collectors of fossils. So in this day and age, how do we balance public and private interests in terms of fossil specimens? Because as it turns out, these can actually sometimes work together to benefit the science, but sometimes not so much. Now, certainly some fossils are absolutely commodities. I mean, coal and petroleum, they are the remains of once existing organisms and are obviously commodities. So is chalk. I mean, chalk is coccolithophorids, they're fossils. And yet we don't balk at thinking it as a commercial product, it's a commodity. And diatomite, the remains of silicious microfossils, which you had in your mouth earlier today. Probably. One of the major components of toothpaste is actually diatoms. Mined as diatomite, as deposits of these things. It's a commonly used abrasive, among many other things. And so, we get diatoms in our mouth now. So we don't have qualms about the fact that certain fossils are indeed commercial products. But when we talk about macroscopic fossils, for the most part, things that you pick up, you look at, that look like the remains of something that once existed, that's something a little different. And so we see, and this is sort of my taxonomy, some people might split it up differently, sort of different stakeholders in terms of the issue. And in this case, the stakeholders involved are who are hunting for fossils. So we've got professional paleontologists, people like me and my colleagues, who are scientists who study the fossil record. That's our job. We study the fossil record, write papers on it and so forth. Typically employed by either museums or universities, but there are other institutions they might be involved with. They might be involved with a geological survey, like a national geological survey or a state geological survey. They might be involved in the national parks or the state park system of the wherever they're around. There are some who are involved in teams that go out there, and when people are putting in like a new road or a new construction site and they come across fossils, there might be a particular state or national law that requires someone to come in and evaluate it, maybe even collect it. And so those people are working for semi-profit or non-profit, depending on the point of view of firms. They're not working for a museum or whatever, but yet are collecting the fossils for study. Then there are the avocational collectors. These are the people who go out and hunt for fossils for fun. Hobbyists, families, enthusiasts, amateurs in the best sense of the word. Amateur is from Latin for they do it for love. That's not to say we don't do it for love as well, or that these guys don't do it for love, but they do it, the avocational collectors do it only for love. And then finally, the commercial collectors, people whose goal is to find a fossil in order to sell it. So people carry on the tradition of Marianne. So professional paleontologists, here's O.C. Marsh and a bunch of grad students and so forth, go out there to various parts of the world. Our primary goal is to, maybe to add to the collections of a museum, but the main reason for that would be to test questions, to answer questions about the diversity of past life. So towards that end, professional paleontologists are the ones most likely to explore places that haven't been gone to before, or have only rarely been gone to before, because those sites are more likely to provide new insights to the science, stuff we haven't discovered before, new species or whatever. So we have an incentive to do that, even with the knowledge that we might not find anything, because the goal is to find something new. So that is a different mentality than some of these other groups. And I'm showing these old-timey pictures of professional fossil collectors. So, for instance, when the American Museum went out to Central Asia, they did not know that there would necessarily be dinosaur fossils there. They were exploring that region as the point of exploration, to expand the realm of knowledge of fossils of ancient time, as I talked about before, as archaeology and anthropology and botany and so forth. Then there are the avocational or amateur collectors. They are by far the largest number, orders of magnitude larger than the professional community. Because these people, this isn't their living, this is their hobby. It's great because it generates interest in fossils and in nature and science among the general public. The fact that you can go out there and find ammonites or shark's teeth or whatever. These guys are actually collecting at the sites that Mary Anning used to work. Many, many important finds have been made by avocational collectors. And they often donate the better specimens to museum collections. You get, sort of a point of pride to say, I have a specimen that I found, and it's in the collections of the Smithsonian or the American Museum or the National Museum in Paris or whatever. And if you're an avocational collector, you don't want to spend weeks going out somewhere prospecting where it's quite possible you won't find anything. That's not a good use of your time. So avocational collectors tend to prospect sites that are known to produce large quantities of common fossils that look good. Because if you're doing it over the course of a weekend or an afternoon, you want a pretty good chance of getting something that looks nice. So these people are going out there, they make a lot of finds, but they tend to be reinforcing previous discoveries, and that's fine. And then there are commercial collectors. These are the smallest number. So there are many more professional paleontologists than there are commercial collectors. And of course, I said orders of magnitude more avocational collectors. Whereas we professional paleontologists tend to specialize by a number of different things. It might be specializing by taxon. So I work on theropods. I tend to work on theropods of any region. Other people might specialize on some sort of environment or something. A commercial collector tends to specialize in a particular region. this corner of Wyoming, that corner of South Dakota or North Dakota or something like that. So you get to know the sites really well. You get to know the details of that environment really well and so forth. In many cases, they're among the best outfits able to get a team to get out into the field, because that's basically what they do, and to run preparation labs, labs where you take the specimens and prepare them out. And some of them will cooperate with researchers. You know, they will contact us if they find something that they think is really new. They'll provide the data that they collect in good cases. But that's not universally true. There are outfits that are into the field simply as trophy collectors. They don't want to deal with us annoying paleontologists. They won't necessarily want to collect data about the geology, the microfossils, and so they want good-looking specimens. Now, there's been sort of a mixed bag in there. You don't see quite as much anymore, and those are hired crews. So back in the old days, and this is literally the 1870s, when paleontologists like O.C. Marsh or Cope or whatever were doing digs, they didn't actually send the students out there all the time, or they themselves weren't there. They would just hire people who were local and have them dig up. So those are, they're collecting commercially in a sense. They're getting paid to do it. They're not specialist scientists or anything, but neither are they selling the fossils back to the professionals. They're being paid to collect them for a professional. Now, once upon a time, there was this family, the Sternbergs, who were sort of a fossil hunting dynasty. They were among the best commercial fossil collectors in history. So here's the patriarch of the family, Charles H. Sternberg. And they actually collected all over North America, and I believe some of them were brought to work in South America at one point as well. They worked throughout the geologic column, so from the Paleozoic on up to the Cenozoic. So here's a horse that they're collecting. And here's some of the kids. I unfortunately don't have the dates for Ethel, but there are the three sons. And so here's a specimen of a ceratopsid that I believe is one of the specimens in the collection of the American Museum in New York City. And this specimen, I think, might be in what's now called the Sternberg Museum in Kansas. It's a mosasaur. And they actually perfected a lot of the techniques of collecting, recording data in the field, and so forth. And as far as I know, the vast majority of the specimens that they found wound up in museums. Basically, they either would be hired by a museum, sort of like paleo mercenaries. So we want specimens from the Morrison Formation. Go find us some cool stuff from the Morrison Formation. To go out there and do that. Or they would be going around prospecting, come across what looked like the likely remains of something, and then they would send letters to various museums and say, we found a such and such. Would you be interested in that? And that way, the museums sort of bid against each other for who would get it. But that's not the case now. We don't have too many of these groups that are going out there collecting for museums per se. The commercial collectors are buying them or collecting them for sale. If a museum happens to put together enough money to collect them, they're fine with that. But everyone's money is just as green, or whatever color it is where it's coming from. And so they have a lot of really good specimens, and I'll talk about some of those specimens, looks like on Monday, have found their way outside the realm of science. But I want to put forward some of the pro-commercial collector arguments. They'll point out that they're able to do the work that museums and universities might not be able to do. After all, if their outfit is to find fossils and prepare them, that's their job. If they're working, they're doing that. Whereas a university, a museum, etc., might find when budgets get hard, it is easy to cut someone's budget and say, you don't need a fossil prep lab this year, and whatever, and they have to let those people go. And consequently, some of these teams have very skilled professional workers with them. Not all. And I want to point out, some of them are crappy. And as they'll say, some of the fossils out there will otherwise erode away. Technically true, but that is what it is. In the US, and at least in some other countries, commercial collecting is in fact legal, at least on private land. And one of the things I'll talk about on Monday, are some of the different rules in different nations, or even different rules within one nation about collecting. And the commercial firms represent an avenue that people who started off as avocational collectors, as amateurs, can go into if they will want to go through the process of undergrad and grad school and postdoc and so forth that you would need to be a professional research scientist. And it's not for everyone. What I do is definitely not for everyone. Even for people who really like the subject, it's not for everyone. And as I point out, many fossil species are indeed common. And so the sale of these particular fish or something may not prevent us from getting knowledge about that species. That said, there are a lot of points that highlight some of the problematic aspects of commercial collecting. Incidentally, what you see here is at the Tucson Rock Show, the world's largest rock and fossil show, held every year in the city of Tucson, Arizona. This is one of dozens of rooms in that. And yes, that is a diplodocid for sale. Complete diplodocid skeleton for sale. Many, many, many such fossils go for sale, and of course not all of them are as big as the diplodocid. As we will see on Monday, there are cases where important specimens have been removed from research, from the public, and from the idea of posterity or public trust. That is, a museum has an obligation as an institution to preserve these specimens not just for the now, but for generations to come. Which is why, I am able to go and work on specimens collected by O.C. Marsh or the Sternbergs or William Buckland. I have worked on some of the specimens that Buckland found when he first named Megalosaurus and so forth. When they go into someone's property, they're their property. And there's no reason they have to let anyone have access to them. Also, when commercial firms start making agreements with private landowners to collect on them, they can give them a cut of the action. On the flip side, research grants typically do not say, we're going to pay for this much bribe money to the landowners, since our goal is not to make money off of recovering fossils. Because of that, if you're a private landowner and you got some people who are offering you cash to work their land and other people who aren't, there's an incentive to not let these guys, not let the scientists on there, and to just let the commercial collectors come in. In at least some places, commercial collecting is done by people without proper training, resulting in the damaging of fossils, and sadly, sometimes the damaging of people. I've had colleagues who've worked in northern Africa, in Morocco and so forth, where there are just locals who want to dig up fossils. They don't know the background of how you're supposed to approach digging up fossils, and they have found people dead in pits, because they know you're supposed to dig, so they just like down, and the thing collapsed on them. They were doing it by yourself. Don't go out into the wilderness by yourself. There's entire movies about that. And sadly, these people, died in the pursuit of a quick buck with fossils. And, as we'll see on Monday, the fact that they become an item that's sold, they've been commodified. Commoditization encourages the overexploitation of a resource, in this case fossils, collecting for trophies and not for science. And if the goal is to get a trophy, something that looks good, it incentivizes fraud. Because whereas a scientist wants a fossil that's comprised only of the parts of one individual, a trophy wants to be complete. And so there are people, as we'll see, who will take bits and pieces of other creatures and glue them together, basically, to make them look good. So we will pick up on Monday about issues of paleoethics, and then talk about some of the broader issues with regard to the legacy of dinosaurs, including dinosaurs in popular culture. And I will see you then for the last lecture.